Voluntary Assisted Dying, what's happening around the world. I'm Mark, I'm a GP based in Dublin in Ireland, and I believe that voluntary assisted dying should be legally available to all adults as a choice at the end of their lives. Voluntary assisted dying has become a norm in many jurisdictions internationally and in increasing number of countries in Europe in the last decade. So the point of this video is to highlight how voluntary assisted dying operates internationally and around Europe. This is a map of the world that shows those countries and jurisdictions where VAD is lawfully available. Starting in North America, and firstly in Canada, medical assistance in dying, or MAID, is being legally available since 2016. It's important to note, compared to Ireland, that there was a constitutional right to die decided in their courts. The Supreme Court case in 2013 with Marie Fleming categorically said there isn't a constitutional right to die in Ireland. So we would be different in that the government can legislate for VAD, and that's how VAD will become legally available in Ireland. I'll note the qualifying conditions in particular in Canada, New Zealand and Australia, because our model of care borrows from those three jurisdictions in particular. So a patient must have a grievous and irremediable medical condition. They must be an adult who can freely choose it. They must have capacity. They must be in an advanced state of decline that cannot be reversed, with unbearable physical or mental suffering from the illness, disease or disability or state of decline that cannot be relieved under conditions that the person considers acceptable. They must be resident in Canada, and there are multiple safeguards. Just a word about public support. In Canada, about 8-9 years in, public support for VAD or MAID remains really high at 84%. There are almost 20,000 requests for MAID each year from the latest statistics, and about 3/4 of those end up receiving medical assistance in dying. That's around 4% of all deaths. Around 1/4 do not receive medical assistance in dying. They might die before they receive MAID, or they withdrew their request. The average age of recipients is about 77, and advanced terminal cancer is the most common condition. There's also a new Track 2 process that is not fully implemented when a natural death is not reasonably foreseeable. It's not fully implemented, and that's unusual compared to Australia and New Zealand. So in the United States, we are probably all aware that Oregon in 1997 has had lawful availability of assisted dying. But since 1997, there are now 10 states in total, and that number is growing. Most of these states are pretty similar in that it involves adults. Adults must have a terminal illness with often a less than 6-month prognostic clause. Multiple oral and written requests are needed. Waiting periods are needed. Doctor approvals and self-administration is permitted. So over 28 years now, Oregon has had assisted dying, and there's really been no change. There's been no slippery slope. And you can see in 2017, as one example, there were around 1,100 deaths. And again, like Canada, most were over 65, most had cancer. So let's move down to South America very quickly. Colombia and Ecuador are the two countries that have lawful availability of assisted dying. Legal access to VAD has been decriminalized here, I guess, since 1997, but it's only since 2014, and then in 2015 with the implementation of the guidelines that really VAD has been available. So it's through self-administration and physician-supported options. Under very strict grounds, so it's mostly for adults who have a serious incurable condition causing dignified loss of life. Consent is needed, the committee reviews are needed, and looking up the data myself this week, I can see that there were 270 procedures 2 years ago. So it's not a large number of applications that end up going through to VAD. Ecuador is a new country that has decriminalized voluntary assisted dying, followed a high profile case of a patient with motor neuron disease who brought a court challenge. So the guidelines for voluntary assisted dying in Ecuador since April 2024 are they must be resident in the country, they must have an incurable condition confirmed by independent registered medical professionals, they must have capacity, there's a committee that oversees all these requests, decisions are issued, there's a 10-day confirmation period, and then a doctor and nurse have to be present for the VAD. And I can see that the first application and the first voluntary assisted death only occurred 2 months ago in May 2025. Before we get to Europe, let's look at Australia and New Zealand. And these are two countries that the Irish model has borrowed heavily from. So starting with Australia. So the service first commenced in Victoria, the state of Victoria, in 2017. It was the first area, but from November 2025, all jurisdictions in Australia will have lawful access to voluntary assisted dying. Less that I can see that from the latest review board statistics, that makes up about less than 1% of all deaths are from VAD. Compared to Canada and compared to most jurisdictions, interestingly, most deaths are self-administered compared to physician-supported voluntary assisted dying. And like other jurisdictions, the average age of patients are in their 70s. The most likely qualifying condition is from cancer. And again, like all other countries, all patients who access VAD have access to palliative care. It's not an absence of palliative care that drives people towards choosing voluntary assisted dying. I'll make a special note of the eligibility criteria for Australia and New Zealand, given we're borrowing their models. So it's over 18-year-olds who have capacity, who have a voluntariness, and have there's no coercion at play. Their request is ongoing and enduring. It's an advanced, incurable condition that is expected to cause death within 6 months or within 12 months if it's a neurodegenerative condition. So our Joint Oireachtas Committee borrowed that. That's causing suffering that cannot be relieved in a way that the person finds tolerable. It excludes mental health and disability as a qualifying condition, and the patient must be an Australian citizen. There are 3 requests, 2 independent doctors, either self-administered or health practitioner administered. There's a very controversial gag clause that universally they're recommending they remove. That means that the doctor cannot bring up VAD as a potential option at the end of life. And there are multiple safeguards. So moving on to New Zealand, the End of Life Choice Act came into force in 2021. It was passed 2 years previously. And over a 12-month period, the latest statistics show that there's kind of relatively fewer applications and fewer, VAD certificates granted. So there were 350 assisted deaths roughly over a 12-month period. Same demographic information like Canada and Australia. Again, most of these patients are receiving palliative care, but they choose voluntary assisted dying. And most of the deaths occur at the patient's home. And in New Zealand, you can see that most of the deaths here were physician supported rather than the patient self-administered. The eligibility criteria, again, are very similar to Canada. Adults, New Zealand citizens, they have competence to make informed decisions. They're suffering from a terminal illness that's likely to end their life within 6 months. An advanced state of irreversible decline in their physical capability. They're experiencing unbearable suffering that cannot be relieved in a manner that the person considers tolerable. And it excludes mental health, disability, and old age as a qualifying condition. So lastly, let's move on to Europe so you can see how VAD operates here. So there are increasing numbers of countries in Europe that now have legal access to voluntary assisted dying. Starting with Spain, which commenced in 2021, The eligibility criteria are adults with a severe or chronic debilitating condition, a serious incurable disease, and they must be resident in Spain for a year. There are multiple steps in the pathway, and there are multiple timeframes to wait. So there are 2 requests over 15 days apart, so it's a little bit bureaucratic. It ends up going to a regional review committee that will deem whether or not it is acceptable, and that comes from I suppose there are multiple high-profile patient cases, such as Ramon San Pedro, who died in 1998. That kind of catapulted the movement for voluntary assisted dying in Spain. And so the data from Spain in 2022, the annual report showed that there were less than 300 voluntary assisted deaths. Like other countries, mostly patients between the age of 60 and 80 with cancer or severe neurological conditions. A third of applicants died before the application was approved. GPs, like in most countries, are the most common responsible doctor providing the service. And many of the applications were denied here. You can see that less than 20% were denied. And again, like most countries, most were physician provided. In Switzerland, it's an unusual case because you can see since Oregon in 1998, and then with Netherlands and Belgium, assisted dying has kind of increased in prevalence. But actually, Switzerland goes back to 1942, and I guess importantly in Switzerland, active voluntary assisted dying remains illegal. So it's only self-administered assisted dying that is lawful in Switzerland. So there are a number of non-governmental organizations that, such as Dignitas, that operate under a court precedence there, and any mentally competent adult can self-administer a lethal medication there. So if there's constant and unbearable suffering, because it's available to non-residents, that has generated a ethical issue in which many individuals travel to Switzerland to access assisted dying, even though it isn't physician supported. So even though it's there a long time, it has many challenges. And I guess those countries that have implemented assisted dying, particularly in the last 10 years, seem to have a much better model of care. Luxembourg has legal access since 2009 for competent adults with an incurable illness and unbearable suffering, requires 2 physicians and multiple requests and an expert committee to oversee it. There were only 25 cases in 2020. Austria legalized assisted dying in 2022 following a constitutional court ruling. Self-administration is the only option there, and it's for adults who have a serious permanent or terminal illness or who suffer from unbearable suffering, and they must be able to have capacity to make decisions. 2 doctors needed, multiple safeguards again. The next 2 countries are unusual. So we're going to talk about the Netherlands and then Belgium. So they are slightly more liberal than the other countries we've mentioned, particularly Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. So it's lawfully available for 23 years in both of these countries, Netherlands and Belgium, for competent adults with unbearable suffering. But unlike most countries, the law allows for minors, so those over 12 in the case of Holland, with parental consent, and also for voluntary assisted dying on mental health grounds. That brings a significant ethical debate, and that is not what is proposed for Ireland. Multiple requests are needed, and in 2019 there were just over 6,000 deaths in Holland for voluntary assisted dying. So like Holland, in 2021 there were just over 2,500 deaths from voluntary assisted dying, and it was the first country to allow access to minors in 2014 with parental consent. So and there's also grounds to access assisted dying under mental health grounds, and again that is not what is proposed for Ireland. So in May 2025, France passed a bill to legalise voluntary assisted dying, likely to be enacted in 2026 for adults with irreversible illness and unbearable suffering. Both options of self-administration or provider-administered options will be available. The United Kingdom, only England and Wales have passed the terminally ill adults bill in June 2025 last month, and that's going to the Lords and it's likely to be passed. Like other jurisdictions, it's for adults who can make decisions and have capacity with a less than 6-month approval. There's a 2-doctor assessment and a multidisciplinary panel. Really bizarrely, unlike really every other country that has allowed for voluntary assisted dying in the last 10 years, it's only for patients to self-administer medication, so it really restricts choice, and that's a challenge, and that will have to change. And obviously conscientious objection is supported. The Isle of Man have passed assisted dying bills, so has Jersey, and implementation is pending in both of those jurisdictions. In Germany, in 2020, the Constitutional Court affirmed the individual right to die by voluntary assisted dying, but detailed law is pending. So that's for patients over 18 with an irreversible illness and unbearable suffering. And my last slide is just to state that there's a parliamentary process underway in Portugal, and the likely criteria will include patients with an incurable illness with unbearable suffering, and reviews and safeguards like in other countries that I've mentioned. In Ireland, I'd recommend that you'd watch my video on the proposed model for voluntary assisted dying in Ireland, and also the historical context to voluntary assisted dying in Ireland. But just to say that the Oireachtas Committee has recommended that we should legislate for voluntary assisted dying. In Italy, a constitutional court has decriminalised assisted dying under very narrow conditions, but there isn't full legislation. You can see that voluntary assisted dying is increasingly available internationally and around Europe. The models of care are converging and are quite similar, with a small number of outliers which are more liberal, like the Netherlands. Another video will look at the proposed model of voluntary assisted dying in Ireland, which borrows from New Zealand and Australia. It's worth stating that VAD can be enacted through legislation in Ireland, and to know more about the Irish context on VAD, I have a brief video. There are several arguments that are made by those who oppose VAD in all circumstances, and I have a video which I hope addresses some of those arguments, and those videos are in the links below. I hope you found this video and other videos informative. Please follow Irish doctors who support medical assistance in dying and End of Life Ireland if you are interested in this topic, and don't forget to lobby your TD to legislate for VAD. Thank you.